So you've just finished up applying your personal experiences with stress to the survey that you completed and the terminology and models in Chapter 4. So now that we're all thinking about stress and maybe a little stressed out from thinking about stress, let's move on to what to do with that stress and talk about coping. So this model is presented in your book to demonstrate the impact of stress on psychological and physiological responses. The model conveys that coping can be enacted at multiple times along the path so that this can prevent stress from leading to disease outcome. Now let's map on this stress model to the models of stress that we discussed in last topic. So let's first remember Cellier's general adaptation syndrome provided us a very biological account of the different phases between a stressor, perceiving a stressor, and an individual getting to phase 4, where your health and even death can be a consequence. In Cellier's model, the important thing is that you get back to homeostasis. We learned that another word for this is allostasis, where the body perceives a stressor, but it can get back to baseline. If you've reached phase 4, then allostatic load is commenced, and this is where the load of the stress and the stressor makes it where your body can't return to baseline, so you can't shut off the stress response, which sounds a lot like what we saw in Robert Sapolsky's video when he was talking about the very evolutionary basis for stress. Next, let's think about the transactional model, and this provided us a more contemporary view where an individual's appraisal of stress must be considered. Many of you discussed this idea in your health profile. You said that you knew you had a lot of stressors, or maybe taking the undergraduate stress questionnaire made you see how many stressors you had, but you really didn't feel stressed. So you were discussing that your perceived stress is a lot lower than your actual stress, and this is your stress appraisal. And finally, a reminder back to the diathesis stress model, which helps us to consider how people aren't coming from a vacuum. We have different genetic risks for stress and different environmental experiences that impact how we feel stress and how we deal with coping. So keeping all these models in mind, I hope this week you get insight into your biological aspects of coping, how there are individual differences in coping, and how you have different genetic predispositions towards coping mechanisms. Which of these models do you think is most helpful in describing your stress and coping? I'm asking you in the Module 2 assignment to discuss one of these in your introductory paragraph. So start to think about which one you think is most helpful for you. So let's get on to coping. Let's start with a basic definition of coping and walk through some different types of coping. So coping are efforts to deal in some manner with a harmful or threatening situation to remove or diminish the stress. And I want to talk about two main approaches, problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. With problem-focused coping, this is when you are doing something that will directly lower the stress. So this is some task, some approach that's aimed at the stressor itself. It's very action-oriented. So, for example, you could be very stressed because you're studying because a test is coming up, and so a problem-focused approach for coping would be to start to study for that test, and that should lower your stress levels because you're taking this very action-oriented approach. Alternatively, we could use the example of you're starting to stress out because you feel like you don't have any money. And so a very problem-focused cope might be to cut back on some expenses you don't need to make, like that overly expensive Starbucks coffee, or maybe getting a second job. But it's something that's aimed at directly lowering the stressor itself. Now, another approach that can be taken is emotion focused, and this is going to be aimed at reducing the emotions associated with the stressor. So an example could be that you get hurt by a friend does something that really hurts your feelings, and so you sort of have to reframe, think about, well, they didn't mean to do it, or maybe this was more your issue than them, maybe you're overly sensitive, and so you get over it. So you're really just targeting more acceptance or reframing, and you're actively processing processing your emotions to try to reduce the stressor. Another example for emotion focused could be when you do reframing. That's a great way when something bad happens, it really stresses you out, but then you sort of think through it and say, oh, well, here are the good things that came out of that stressful situation, and that can reduce the feelings of feeling stress. So let's sort of think about these two approaches. Now, one thing that we need to acknowledge is that sometimes there are some issues that cannot be dealt with problem-focused coping. So a good example is a death of a loved one, where there's nothing you can do to bring that loved one back. So this is when emotion-focused coping is going to be most effective in just trying to reframe. Think about the grieving process as a coping process where you're accommodating, you're accepting, and you're reframing. Even though typically we see that problem-focused coping is more effective at reducing stressors, we have to acknowledge that there are going to be some problems that you can't use this approach with. So let's think about a few other types of coping mechanisms. Preventive or proactive coping. This can be an approach that we could really see this being problem focused or emotion focused, depending on what you're doing, but it's just the idea that a stressor is coming up and you are doing something ahead of the time, acknowledging that the stressor is going to be there. So this is sort of anticipatory coping. This is typically a more active form of coping. Actually, the example I gave you of studying for an exam could be preventive or proactive coping. The example I gave you of coping with the death of a loved one. For people who know that a loved one is going to die, they may be going through this sort of pre-grieving phase where once the loved one dies, they almost sort of feel a relief, likely because the loved one is not in pain any longer, but they've gone through that process of coping prior to the stressor. Another approach to coping, and this is a much less effective coping mechanism, is avoidance coping. It's also called disengagement coping. This is, as you can see, I put an ostrich bearing their head in the sand to sort of help you to remember what this is about. So this is not really taking the bull by the horns or trying to work through your emotions. This is just trying to not think about your stressor. So this would be if you sort of have wishful thinking, oh, everything's going to be fine. If you are giving up on your goals, so if some stressor is coming up and you say, oh, well, it wasn't that important to me in the first place. Avoidance coping, as you can see from these examples, is really not an effective approach. It's typically wildly unsuccessful in the long term. However, we can think about how it might be adaptive in the short term. So I can see myself using this approach to coping when I get that one more email that I need to do something and I just have too much on my plate that day, and I will tell myself, okay, you can just not respond to that email for 24 hours. Work on everything else, just a very short-term avoidance of a stressor. Now, if I just said, oh, I'm not going to respond to that email at all, then probably whatever stress that it is bringing me, it's just going to be compounded because I'm not tackling this situation. So you were given a coping questionnaire, and you had a long list of questions, and those questions could be grouped together into these 8 different subscales. So I want to sort of walk you through how these different subscales map on to the different types of coping that I just explained, because this could be something that you could discuss in your module assignment. So first, we can see the problem-focused coping, confrontive coping. There were certain items that talked about standing your ground, trying to take action, letting your feelings show, planful problem solving, drawing from past experiences, moving forward. So you can see how these are very action oriented. We also had some emotion focused, seeking social support. So this could be talking to that person that helps you to process or reframe or accept a stressor. Positive reappraisal. This could also be reframing, focusing on personal change, and accepting responsibility. So this, the items we're talking about. Sort of blaming or being self-critical of yourself, making a promise that things would be different the next time. And then finally, we see some avoidance coping subscales. So, distancing, self controlling, and escape avoidance. All of these are more indicative of not really trying to tackle the stressor, but just trying to distance yourself from it. So, when you're thinking about coping, I hope you keep in mind that we have lots of contextual factors that explain individual differences. One is gender. So, if I ask you, what do you think? Do women use more emotion focused or do men use more emotion focused? And I think the majority of you would quickly say that women typically are using a more emotion focused approach to coping. They're more likely to talk to friends, to use social support, and men are more likely to use problem focused. In fact, many of you can think of some argument that you got in with your significant other where the sort of the typical, the male saying, well, you need to do this, and the female saying, I don't need a solution, I just want you to listen to what I'm saying. However, while research does support this, there was also research presented in your book that talks about, well, if you compare women and men of similar occupations, educations, and income, that these gender differences disappear. So we might be sort of comparing apples and oranges, but when you compare more women and men who have selected into certain occupations, have certain educations and incomes, then we don't really see this gender difference. Another really important aspect to individual differences are your genes. Your genes can moderate how people respond to catastrophic events. Your book discovers several concepts that are highly influenced by your genes, such as hardiness, personality, optimism, and cardiovascular reactivity. So all of these could impact how you cope and how effective it is for you. Similar to hardiness, resilience is discussed, and this is a huge interest to psychologists. Resilience explains why people do well despite the odds. It is demonstrated all the time through the media. You'll see stories about people who should be doing much worse than they are, but somehow they're defying the odds. Now, we know that there is a genetic component to this, such as the 5-HTT allele that you read about in Module 1, but we're also interested in how environmental components like relationships and experiences could increase resilience, because this is something that we could target for vulnerable populations to try to increase their likelihood of a good outcome. We know that SES is related to poor health outcomes, even though this is likely due to higher stress and less resources. Perhaps there are also poor coping mechanisms that are a contributing factor. Your book presents a study in North Carolina that demonstrated higher alcohol consumption, cigarette smoking, and risk of hypertension in low SES African American sample, as well as less perceived emotional support as compared to those from a higher SES background. So that's another individual difference you could consider. Personal control is the belief that we can make our own decisions and determine what we do, and this might also be a contributing factor for individuals who come from a lower SES background, where they don't feel they have as much personal control in their finances, in their job, in tackling some of their problems. We sort of can see some learned helplessness. Similarly, your book discussed regulatory control, and that's the various ways that we can modulate our thinking, emotions, and behaviors over time and across different circumstances. So how do you think that genes versus the environment contribute to these constructs that have been linked to better coping? So all of these things that I'm talking about, these individual differences, they might be a good thing for you to consider in your Module 2 write-up when you're trying to explain some of the null results we had in our hypotheses. So some of our hypotheses, our data didn't support it, but we really did pretty simple analyses. We could have done some much more complex regression models or ANCOVA models that brought some of these factors in. Now, because many of you don't have, or there's varying statistical backgrounds across the class, I wanted to do things that were very simple. But you could absolutely bring in some of these individual factors as examples for why you think that just simply looking at how one variable relates to another without considering how these other variables are influencing it could explain that null result. I want to talk a little about some methodological issues in coping research. One thing we have to take into account, something that we did in our survey, is we were measuring coping and stress at the exact same time when we were just talking about how coping typically would happen after the stressor. You could be doing some proactive coping, so coping could act before the stressor, but there is a temporal order. Such that if we're looking at just one snapshot, one cross-sectional approach, we may be missing out on the relationship, the true relationship between stress and coping. And this is why a longitudinal study is really important. But even in longitudinal studies, coping researchers are sort of uncertain. What's a time frame that we should look at? Should we be doing an ecological momentary assessment and looking at stress and coping at multiple times across the day? Should we look at them weekly, monthly? How can we sort of tap into this lag time between when a stressor happens and when coping is enacted, and what is that optimal time frame between the two? Another thing we need to keep into account is, are self-reports accurate? I was looking through how long it took everybody to take the survey. It took me and my TA about 30 minutes, and there were some people who finished it in less than 10 minutes. And that makes me question the validity of those measures, if people were just checking the boxes and not really reading them. So there's could be some bias in just people not being careful in how they take surveys, so it doesn't really represent who they truly are. There also can be some bias in when you say that you're doing something, but unconsciously maybe you're doing another, or maybe you are overly positive on the type of coping mechanisms that you do. So we have to take that into account. And then, of course, we have to take into account individual differences. So another thing you could discuss in your Module 2 assignment is, what were some questions in there that were missing. So I asked you, for example, how many hours you were working outside of class, but I didn't ask you about how many hours you had to deal with family, or you had to deal with athletics. You had to deal with other stressors that you weren't being paid for, but definitely contribute to a large portion of the time that you have to allocate towards certain things. Other factors discussed in your book were gratitude, humor, pet, spirituality, and invisible support. Now, we did have a measure of humor, but these other factors were missing in our survey. And how much do they contribute to your stress level? I know there were many of you in your health profile who spoke about your spirituality. Even invisible support, I mean, that's something hard to measure, but it's this idea that you feel you have somebody behind you, even if that you aren't really using them. So you may feel that your parents are always there for you, even if you're not actively talking to them. You may feel one stressor, financial stressor. You may feel you could go to certain people for money, even if you don't have to use that support. And just the fact that you have that invisible support there can be very helpful. I know personally, pets are huge for my life. My husband and I both talk about how when we get home, we just sort of take a sigh of relief from the stressors of the day and just laugh at these very goofy animals and what they do in our life. So that's something that I was reflecting on and reading about those other factors with coping. So I look forward to sort of hearing about this in your health profile, and then seeing some of these tied into your Module 2 assignment. Your book also discusses some behavioral interventions. So this is a great example of what can health psychologists do. How can we apply this information? So it discusses relaxation training, mindfulness-based stress reduction, cognitive behavioral therapy, and emotional disclosure. These tactics that can really help people to learn to reduce their stress. So we aren't stuck, even though we know that there's a genetic component, we aren't stuck in one groove with poor coping and not being able to handle stress very well. There are ways that we can help people to try to enact problem focused and emotion focused approaches to reduce their stress levels. So to finish up the chapter, it ends with a figure that I really love, as it just brings you back to this reminder that we need to consider how this applies to our biopsychosocial view. So when we think about our biological influences for stress and coping, you can talk about greater regulatory control, heartier personality, some social influences, thinking about what does your social support network looks like? How often do you interact with pets? This could be where your church family can really be helpful. And then finally, we have psychological influences. So this could be using active coping mechanisms, being more optimistic or grateful, having a good sense of humor. So I really encourage you to sort of think back to this figure for your Module 2 assignment and to sort of help you organize your thoughts on stress and coping. Your chapter also discussed the use of social support in coping. This is really an important topic for stress and coping, so I'm going to provide you an additional mini lecture focusing just on that, so stay tuned.